Welcome to the Operations Science Podcast, where the art and science of operational excellence come to life through captivating stories of triumph, challenge, and transformation from the front lines of industry. Our distinguished guests, from manufacturing pioneers and medical device innovators to aerospace visionaries, diagnostic lab leaders, and major capital project leaders, unveil the hidden patterns and powerful insights that drive exceptional results in the complex world of operations. Join us on this journey of discovery as we explore the brilliant minds behind the systems that make our world work and uncover the leadership secrets that could revolutionize your approach to operations forever. This podcast is brought to you by the Operations Science Institute, the home of the science behind every operation. If you want to be a better operations or project leader, discover the principles of operations science for yourself. For a quick tour, visit the OSI Insider portal. The web address is insider.opscience.org, and be sure to check out the new book, Operations Science Applied, available on Amazon. Here is your host, Ed Pound.
Welcome to the Operations Science Podcast. Our guest today manages infrastructure, delivery, risk, and real-world execution in construction projects. In an industry where delays compound, coordination breaks down, and small decisions ripple into multi-million-dollar consequences, he has navigated both project successes and hard-earned lessons across complex construction environments. From integrating contractors and local authorities to managing scope shifts, cost pressures, safety demands, and schedule realism, he has seen firsthand how structure, communication, and disciplined execution determine whether a project becomes a benchmark or a cautionary tale. Today, we explore what separates resilient project delivery from reactive firefighting and how operational clarity can transform construction performance. Please welcome to the Operations Science Podcast, Milton Griffiths. Hey, Milton, how you doing?
Hi, Edward. I'm glad to be on the podcast and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. Just so the audience knows, you mentioned you're in Secunda, South Africa, right? That's, I think you said, an hour and a half from Johannesburg. Is that right?
Yes, it's an hour and a half from Johannesburg and basically home to one of the biggest petrochemical plants in the world currently, where fuel is produced and many other products from coal.
Okay, so it's coal conversion. It's not from petroleum.
Yes, it's coal conversion, and coal is converted into different fuels, gases, even petroleum products. Yes.
All right. So when you look back at your major infrastructure projects, what separates projects that have succeeded from the ones that have struggled?
I think the biggest difference between a successful project and a project that's struggling is determined in the beginning of a project life cycle. So first, we need to have a clear scope definition, and we have to have alignment between the stakeholders that are on the project. This means the technical team, the consultants, the engineers, the construction teams, basically consisting out of subcontractors, to whatever local authorities might need to be involved in the project, as well as the client. So we need to have a really clear definition of the scope and make sure that all the parties that are involved on the project or that are affected by the project are aligned. And then secondly, we need to do realistic planning, because a lot of projects struggle because the projects might be politically driven. We might not have the real agenda of the project, and financial pressures can also affect operational realities of projects. So the program really needs to be built around realistic productive rates, realistic resource availability, etc. So those are some of the important components.
Yeah, those are indeed important. A lot of success or failure begins at the beginning of the project. And I think you hit the nail on the head. Are you working mainly with Greenfield projects, new construction, or these brownfield projects where you're working with existing facilities?
Well, currently we have a mix of both. The biggest project that I've worked on so far was a bit of a mix of greenfields and brownfields, but I can say 90 or 80% greenfields and then brownfields. And then, yeah, so in our current environment, we do have projects where we integrate into existing projects just to increase the lifespan of existing facilities and existing infrastructure and production facilities.
Okay. So when you're looking at these projects and you mentioned having a realistic schedule, and I've seen that before. I worked for a couple of years with the Project Production Institute, which works with similar construction projects. Schedule realism is an issue. How do you look at a schedule and determine whether it's actually achievable versus being, as you mentioned, a political goal?
Look, if we start a project, we need to be honest and realistic about the resources we have. We need to look at the procurement strategies that we are implementing. We look at the lead times, etc. Because certain projects don't happen on facilities that are close to industrialized areas where you can, order equipment, important equipment and materials that you need for your construction or off the shelf. So you need to look at your lead times. You need to understand the physicality or your geographical location of your site, because some of the sites are quite remote and they will need you to order equipment, well in advance. You will also have to look at the sequencing of your activities, be really strategic about how you logically sequence the activities and also taking risk into account. There are multiple risks that arise in project or construction projects. And if we don't have any risk allowance, we are really setting ourselves up for failure. So we need to look at your geographical dispensation, you look at your resources, you also need to understand the climate, because these are small things that can affect your schedule. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're working outdoors, so weather is a source of variability.
100%, 100%.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the long lead items. I mean, some of these items, sometimes take years if they're looking at complex motors or valves or whatever they might be. What we found at the Project Production Institute was sometimes suppliers quote very long lead times, but it doesn't really take them that long. They just quote the long lead times because they're used to the project managers or owners moving schedules around, which makes it difficult for them. Do you go to your suppliers and work with them on their lead times, or is that something where you just take it as a given?
Well, there are some suppliers that are accessible, but also in the context of our projects, we have a lot of OEMs that are not, you know, based here. So it's a lot of remote ordering and communication. So it's not always feasible and practical to physically interact with the suppliers and drive them. So what we try to do, or rather, when I evaluate a project, I'm not looking at the dates, but I'm evaluating whether the construction plan or the plan that we have in front of us, does it actually reflect how construction happens on site? Because the construction is really just a plain logical thing, but with so many other dynamic elements.
Very complex. Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, yeah, I get that. I mean, some of the suppliers, I mean, you might have things coming from Europe or North America or wherever. And so going and working with them might not be as practical. But that being said, if it's a really expensive piece of equipment, maybe it makes sense to do that. But it depends on the situation. When you look at how you control what I would call work in process or inventory on site, one of the things that we found was that project managers have a famous saying, I'd rather be looking at inventory than looking for it. And so what that drives them to do is to order everything ahead of time, which has its own set of problems. How do you manage inventory, which includes equipment, when you're managing a project?
All right. So typically in your brownfields projects, you will form basically a sort of, it's associated to routine maintenance. So in your brownfield projects, you will have a typical expectation, or you basically have a typical predictability of the types of equipment that you'll be using. And, there from experience, how you work in terms of your lead times and how long you can take to get whatever you need for your project. Right. So in that sense, it's a bit easy. But when it comes to greenfields projects, it's a bit challenging, but you find that within the greenfields space, for instance, we work on electrical installations where we might do an entire substation from the ground up. So within the substation, you have equipment that you might also use in a brownfields project. So you have a bit of a gauge. Then you have a mix of new equipment, because sometimes with the greenfields projects, you have entirely new technology that you are installing, and then there you need to really look at tracking your lead times. You need to be very good with your communication with your procurement team. You have to monitor your delivery schedule. You have to have resources available that can tackle all the logistics issues when they arise. And coordinating with the supplier, sometimes, like you were saying, going physically to the supplier and having conversations with them, making them understand your needs and the urgency of what you do. Because sometimes doing things over the phone or over email is not as effective as when you go there. So sometimes you find that they can pull strings for you to make things happen quicker in terms of making sure your inventory is sorted. So there are in some instances where your inventory can be, everything can be ready for you. You can store your equipment, sign it in and have it ready for construction. But there are certain instances, like, for instance, with concrete. In the previous project that I did, I had to order concrete because the site was, I can say, a remote site. So I had to order concrete from, another town, and it's about an hour drive for the trucks. So in that instance, you're working in real time, you're working with complex logistics. So if the weather also comes into play and it starts raining, or even when you go to sub temperatures, then it also becomes a bit of a challenge to pour your concrete or to cast your concrete, because there are certain temperatures at which you cannot cast concrete when the temperatures are too low. So yeah, so in terms of inventory, there are those that you can get readily available, those that you can, pull strings to get quickly to your sites, those that you can store on sites, and then there are those ones that you have to, it works in real time. You have to order on the day, but you also sequence your planning. You look at the weather forecast, you look at how the temperatures will be, you look at the seasons in which you work, because in some areas, that it's a rainy season, you can expect up to 3 weeks of rain continuously, and then you have to schedule your activities that will be affected by the inventory in such a way that it aligns with your climate and so on. Yes.
Well, that's a good point with the weather. 3 weeks of rain, that's a lot of rain continuously. One of the things, so along those lines, so in the operations science framework, when you're trying to create a project or do a construction project, that's the demand, and you have a demand for resources, and the demand and the supply don't always synchronize. And so you can have capacity where you have a lot of people available. You can have inventory if that's possible. You can't have an inventory of concrete because you have to use it the day you place the concrete, or things wait. One of the things that's a little bit different about construction from typical manufacturing is a capacity limiter actually is your laydown area. So we've actually had experiences where, there's a picture of a laydown area. It's covered with equipment and supplies. You say, okay, that's interesting. Where does the building go? Well, the building goes right there where the laydown area is. And ordering all that inventory ahead of time created this problem with now they're actually covering up the site where they're supposed to be working. Do you have those situations? I mean, how do you manage the laydown areas to make sure that you don't get in that situation, that you have just enough inventory and not too much.
Luckily, where we are working now, we do have facilities close by, yeah, especially on our Greenfields project. But we will typically have spaces allocated by the client. We will request during our site establishment, we will request space from the client. And we have certain spatial requirements that we'll have. And one of the techniques we use is to bring in containers, and in the containers we will typically put equipment that is of high value. However, we do have a challenge of crime where some items you do not want to store as inventory, especially electrical cabling, because copper is of high value, and you have a lot of people who risk it all to, you know, go into your site and they can, steal the copper, and so you have the challenges of theft. So there are certain equipment that we are very careful about leaving, on a construction site. But in the previous construction site, it was on the client's premises, but we had to fence off our laydown area, and we had designated areas for, electrical equipment and mechanical equipment. And we also had containers, but in the same area, we had cameras on all four corners of the laydown area because of the theft. And we had three security guards doing their rounds on a daily basis, even during the night shift. So, yeah, so those are some of the dynamics that play out regarding inventory.
Do you ever find out, because of the way procurement orders material, that you don't have enough laydown area?
In our context, is rarely the case. It's rarely the case, yeah. In our context, we haven't really had a lot of challenges where we don't have storage. But if those kind of challenges do come, we'd probably sequence our ordering of equipment in a way that it's a bit delayed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sounds great, because I mean, I've really seen like hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment just sitting around, and sometimes for months or even a year, which is a real problem. And that's where the Project Production Institute addresses this, because most people don't look at construction projects as production processes, but in reality they are. And that's where operations science comes into play, because the same concepts apply. There's a certain amount of work in process inventory that you need, and anything above that just creates problems. And you pointed out an important one, if there's the challenge of theft. Yeah, as you mentioned, that copper cabling is very valuable and very attractive to those people who are looking to convert it into cash. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that laydown area is not an issue. That's one of the first things that we would look for when we go to a site, because it's an indicator of how well the project is being managed. You mentioned a couple of key things. One, timing, and then the other thing is making sure that you have suppliers relatively close, if you can do that, because then they can make it as you need it rather than having to ship it from long ways away. But those are all good practices supported by basic operations science concepts. Very good. So when projects start to go, I'm sure you've worked with successful projects and projects that weren't so successful. When projects start to fall behind schedule, what are the early indicators that you see that say, uh-oh, we're getting into trouble on schedule and maybe cost also? And then what do you do about it?
Yeah, so the subtle things that will start, you know, being red flags to you, you look at when your procurement's schedules are not aligned with how you planned them in the beginning. So you need to keep an eye on your procurement's schedules, have a continuous communication with your procurement team, because slipping on a procurement schedule is one of the indicators or one of the red flags that will show delays. You also look at fatigue on site, when your people are fatigued, because one of the oversights we have in terms of productivity and construction managers, sometimes we push to get work done so fast, but we forget that it's actually the workforce that makes things happen. So you need to find innovative ways to keep your people motivated and keep your people, interested in the project. and interested in getting the things done. So when your team start being fatigued, when the team morale goes down, you should also say, hey, this is a red flag. We should be expecting delays soon. When your variation orders are always piling, or you see the rate of variation orders going up, then you should also start raising our eyebrows, and other things like approvals.
When you say variation orders, do you mean change orders, like changing work?
Yes, because yeah, so it's basically change orders. Yeah. So when they start, being increasing in their rate, then you should also start expecting delays, or start to plan for how you'll manage your delays. So when these kind of indicators or red flags appear, we need to take interventions where we move to our risk register, and we already start documenting them and come up with robust plans of how are we going to tackle them.
And so that's interesting. One of the things that I've seen is that really what drives a lot of poor schedule performance and cost performance is where, and you mentioned it, where crews want to work as fast as possible because efficiency is a big thing. You want to earn all your hours and get work done. But that creates a conflict because you have a contractor who gets paid, for instance, for installing cable. And the more cable they install, the more they get paid. So they want to install cable as quickly as possible. But if they install it and the building structure is not ready, whatever the structure is not ready, you could see where that creates problems in the future because they've installed this cable, but now we have to go back and remove some of it because we have to install a structure around it. Do you see that happening?
Yes, in our context, because of the contracts that we usually have, we have fixed contracts. We're using the NEC contracts, type A contracts. So there's not a lot of room for contractors to play that game, because we can also now start enforcing penalties on them for being late. So how we've seen it playing out, however, is that some of the contractors will actually try to drag the work out so that it coincides with exactly when the allotted time that they have on the schedule, but having them exceeding the schedule can also affect them financially due to penalties that we can enforce as well. So in that sense, the contract can protect both of us in that sense.
Yeah, that's awesome because I mean that is just a very common cause of chaos and cost overruns. This idea of building things as quickly as possible so I can get paid. Do you actually have requirements for, in operating science, we would call that sequence compliance. So you can build ahead maybe a little bit, but once you start getting out of the sequence for all of the dependent tasks, you have to stop to make sure that we don't get too far ahead. Is that in your contracts?
I won't say explicitly it is in our contracts like that, because what happens with us now is, if we do get to a situation where that happens, it puts power into the contractor's hands, where now the contractor can start claiming standing time, and that means they are waiting for the other contractor. So one contractor is done and now waiting for the other one. So in that context, it rarely happens. So what we do have is that we have that the contractor can claim against us, the main contractor. So let's say, for instance, I have to put up a structure, and then after putting up the structure, I have to put in electrical equipment, right? If the civil contractor takes too long, now the electrical contractor can come to me and start claiming and saying, look, I've availed my resources for this period. We are supposed to start last month, and your guys are delaying the site, so they can start claiming against us, and that is basically called standing time in our context. Yes.
So then would you go to the structural contractor and say, well, wait a minute, the electrical guy is asking for money from me because of your delays. You need to pay those delays. How does that work?
Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. Ultimately, it's because the project is it's a constant communication, updating, and mediation process where I have to take care of all the stakeholders as a construction manager alongside the project manager. We also want to keep the working relationship in such a way that it doesn't negatively affect any of the parties. So it's a mediation process, where you see that they are doing things deliberately, or that's where you definitely have to bring down the hammer and enforce discipline through your contract. But there's always a lot of data that we have to take. We need to take weather into account. We need to take resource availability into account, the lead times that we spoke about earlier. Those kind of things, they might affect your progress. And we need to be reasonable about how we enforce the contract to all parties.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you have to be practical about it. There's the letter of the contract, and then there's the emotional response of a contractor who kind of was doing their best and got delayed. But it is a workload. But that's the thing about construction projects is there's a lot of variability, which is, of course, is what operations science is concerned about. How do you best manage that variability? You either have a lot of capacity because you will never have somebody, if somebody's 100% busy, then things are going to start backing up because any sort of variability will cause delays. And that kind of goes against, to your point, you know, there must be some allowance for some standing time, right? So that sounds good because, the fact that the contractor would say, oh, I had people standing around, well, was it for a week or was it for 2 months? I mean, if it's for a week, well, that's just standard. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I want to add into that. I think something that I didn't mention is that in our budget and cost estimates, we do have contingencies which basically allow for this. We also have what we call preliminary and generals, P's and G's, which are basically management fees. So some of these, I can say, they are basically risk buffers that they sort of help us to withstand or to counter some of these risk delays. Yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a buffer. That's what we call a buffer in operations science. So, what do you see in terms of, off the top of your head, if you would say, here are the major misunderstandings that I see that affect construction performance? Are there any that jump out that you would say, oh, yeah, these occur and it causes delays? Is there any misunderstandings either between the contractors around the scope of work or the designs? Anything?
Yeah, I like we were saying in the beginning of your project, it's important that we are all aligned. We have clear definition of, where we're going, what is the scope, you know. But the project is a very dynamic endeavor. So it's not going to, what we say in the beginning, it's the expectation, it's ideal. But because of all the dynamics on the project, you'll find that things like labor availability, they can incapacitate contractors or subcontractors, you know, equipment capacity, because some contractors, you work on a project where you need to give a smaller contractor an opportunity to prove themselves or to work. And, some of the guys, you will find that they don't have as much equipment. Maybe he has two excavators. One is on breakdown, the other one is working on another site. So you have those dynamics playing out. You also might have, in terms of the resource of availability, skill shortage, where this guy, he brought his best team to you, and maybe that week one gets a new job, or someone is sick, or someone has family emergency, etc. So Those are some of the small intricate things that can affect your workload and lead to, sort of misunderstandings. So we try our best to plan within, realistic operational limits. We need to look at the contractors and have honest conversations about their capabilities. But in our country, in the context of our country, we have a principle called Ubuntu. Ubuntu means that we coexist. I am because you are, and you are because I am. So we have that trickling down to our, different contractors sometimes. And you'll find that, okay, if this one is in need of a certain equipment, he can then say, okay, I'll borrow you this equipment for today because you're in need. And, I can cut the price for you, or, I can make this kind of resource available for you, and then you owe me something. So we have that kind of relationship, and that actually is one of the most underrated things happening in our construction environment that actually make things happen in terms of productivity.
So, do you find that most of your projects are on schedule and under budget, or are most of them behind schedule and over budget? What's your experience there?
In the context of green projects, most of the time it's a bit tricky in terms of being on budget. So you'll find you just make it or you are behind, right? But with your brownfields projects, most of the time we are on time because there's a lot of predictability in terms of the brownfields projects. The greenfields projects are a bit tricky, but once you've done a typical greenfields project, your next one, you have, your lessons learned, where you now realize that, okay, I need to put in certain buffers even in terms of your schedule, and you need to be realistic in terms of your productivity rates, the resources that you're onboarding, etc., etc. Yes.
So in summary, brownfield projects are more likely to be on schedule. I don't know about on budget also for brownfield.
Definitely, definitely on budget. Well, most of the projects that we execute, we make a profit. We make a profit. But there are some of those projects where, you know, well, even in the previous organization that I've worked for, where the team will sit and say, you know what, it's the first of its kind. We will make this is more like a guinea pig for us, you know. We're just gonna make a big impression on this client to get one foot in the door. And after that, the impression is made, then other projects starts rolling in. So sometimes it's about the sacrifice, sacrifice one project to get many other projects. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, let's switch topics a little bit. There's a lot of new technology out there: artificial intelligence, digital twins, simulations. Do you see any of that as part of your job as a construction manager, or do your project managers see that? What's your experience with high tech in construction?
Currently, we are not as advanced in terms of, including AI into our construction, but what we have started doing is incorporating drones into our construction, where we can actually go into greenfields, brownfield sites and scan, have aerial views of the actual equipment, have 3D scans coming in from the drones, and then we can design according to those scans, where we don't have to just work on as built, or existing drawings, but we can actually work off real scan drawings. So in terms of the drone technology, that's how we've moved into that space. We do have in the organization people who are in the cyberspace that are also exploring that options. So I think it's just a matter of time before they start rolling it out. But in my personal capacity, I've been dabbling in getting abreast in terms of how I can apply AI technology in for my career advancement. Yes.
Yes, I agree. It's going to become larger and larger part of everyday life, definitely. So that's interesting. That's interesting, though, with that use of drone technology, because, yeah, for a brownfield facility What the drawings were 20 years ago often has nothing to do with what the facility looks like today. So that's a great idea, using the drones. So let's switch topics. Let's talk about Milton Griffiths, the man. Where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? And who were your early influences that kind of got you to where you are today?
I grew up here in South Africa. We have 9 provinces. And the one I grew up in is called the Free State Province. I attended school there, primary school, high school. And at the age of 17, I left and went to Pretoria, the University of Pretoria, where I did my degree in mechanical engineering as well as
All right. Yo, mechanical engineers. That's my degrees too.
also mechanical engineers are just the best. Yes, and I did my honors degree in engineering as well. So most of my influences were, people from my childhood. There's a neighbor of mine who used to be very innovative in the way he used to fix our bicycles, fix our tires. So I learned a lot from him. And one of my neighbors was also someone in the engineering field, and he really influenced me when I looked at him. But the biggest turning point for me was in high school when I saw a design of a military vehicle. It was a CAD design. And I asked my teacher who did that, and he said, "No, it's a mechanical engineer in the military who did that." And I was like, "No, this is what I want to do." So I knew from high school that this is the route I want to take. And then in my career, my passion was really in design engineering. And it turns out in my early start in my career, I was working as a design engineer in the building services sector. That was my first exposure to construction, where we were designing these systems as well as wet services systems. We were designing these for malls, schools, and various infrastructure. And then I transitioned into the bulk materials handling, where I was also design engineer and designing various equipment for mines, power plants, petrochemical plants. And from there, I transitioned into construction management because I was part of teams that were installing this equipment. And eventually, I was assigned to a big project where I had to do the maintenance of a bulk materials handling plant at a power station. And yeah, so that's how I transitioned. And mainly, I can say influenced by the leaders that I was working for, the previous director that I worked for, and lately as well, the project manager that I don't want to mention the guys' names, but they were amazing leaders and they inspired me so much. So
Well, so that's fascinating. So you had neighbors when you were a child, engineering, mechanical types, and then in high school, seeing that CAD drawing really got your interest in mechanical design and a lot of work there. And then you went, you said you were working with a construction project as a design engineer, and then you decided to go into construction. I'm just curious, say a little bit more about, I mean, that's a pretty significant switch from doing mechanical design to being a construction manager. What attracted you to construction management? How did you make that decision?
look, I sort of got catapulted into design. So one of the projects at a power station that we were was basically a 5 year ongoing contract where the company that I was working for had the entire value chain of that plant. So they were the OEM of the equipment. So they installed turnkey solutions. So it was more of fortunately or fortunate or unfortunate. A construction manager had resigned from the plant. And then the director of the company approached me and said, "Hey man, I need you to stand in here for me. You are conversant with this equipment and you understand." And, I went through the various drawings to understand how everything works in that specific plant. And that's how I transitioned into construction. So I've been in construction for the past 6 years, but my combined exposure to construction is about 8 years. Yes.
Okay. Well, so you're getting your scars of experience.
Yeah, I'm getting them. I'm getting them. But I mean, I'm really a fan of engineering technology. It was really a passion. I mean, as a kid, I used to make cars out of wire. I used to draw them first and make them out of wire. And, it was a passion for me.
Do you ever keep in touch with those neighbors who were big influences?
Yeah, I do. I do. One of them is retired now. He was working at the local municipality, he's retired now. So I see him now and then when I go home. And then
Did you tell him what a great influence he was on you and how much you appreciated that? You guys talk about that?
he doesn't know, but
Oh, you got to tell him.
I'm going to tell him. I want to tell him. Last year on his birthday, I sent him a gift. And I didn't say to him, but I just say, hey, thanks, man. You literally raised me, with a lot of things. And yeah, but yeah, I'll take you up on the advice and maybe.
Absolutely. Us old folks like to know when we've actually done something to help somebody. Yeah, definitely. Well, last question. What do you do outside of work for hobbies? Any sports or outdoor activities or?
All right, so I actually do just right next to me. This is artwork.
Oh, wow. You did that?
I did that. I'm a bit of an artist. Let me just show you here. No, I make clothes from scratch. So these are just some of my hobbies.
That's awesome.
I love art. I do art. I make clothes on the side and informally mentor some of the people from my hometown. And then obviously
Yeah, no, so let's not forget that. You mentioned you're going to start a podcast. What's the name of the podcast so the audience knows? Where would they find it?
the name of the podcast preliminary is going to be the Hidden Strength Podcast. And we're planning to launch it on various platforms, Podbean, YouTube, TikTok. And yeah, those are the basic platforms that we're planning to launch it on. So the podcast is really the intent of the podcast is mentorship, because I've been trying to do mentorship, but because of work commitments and traveling far, I used to go to schools in my community and speak to the upcoming youth, but it's a bit of a costly endeavor. So your podcast is much cheaper, and it's a great vehicle, and you can access so many people. I have a very large network of professionals who are very brilliant, and I'd really like them to have conversations with me just to inspire the younger ones and show them what options we have. Yes, yes.
That's great. Well, we need more of that. Well, listen, Milton, thanks so much for sharing your experience in construction and your experience and how you got to where you are now. I wish you the best with the podcast. If you have any questions, I've got my own scars from podcasts, so I'd be happy to help. But thanks so much for being on the podcast. And I'm sure the audience will appreciate the discussion. And I look forward to keeping in touch and talking with you in the future.
Definitely, definitely. I hope this is not the last time. I really want to say thank you for considering me for your podcast. I believe it's actually a great initiative, and it connects so many professionals to the rest of the world. And yeah, and I'll definitely be following your website. I will definitely support your business, for operational management, and then also, share with fellow colleagues and fellow industry professionals.
Please do. That'd be wonderful. All right. Thank you, Milton. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. You too, and all the best.
All right. Thank you.
The Operations Science podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. Join the Operations Science Institute at opscience.org. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode. The views expressed by our guests are their own. and do not represent their company's views unless specifically stated as such.